Hi listeners, I'm Izzy, my pronouns are they and them. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. This is Joella.
Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the country that we're recording this episode on today and pay our respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and their elders, past, present and emerging, by committing to always remembering that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Hello, wonderful people. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. My name is Jean Carruthers. My pronouns are she, her. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this land, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to acknowledge the impacts of colonisation, dispossession and child removal for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and recognise that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners here with us today. Critical and creative pedagogies position social justice at the forefront of social work and human services and work creatively toward social and emancipatory change. In this episode, we will be focusing on unpacking Christine Morley and Phillip Ablett's episode with our crew member, Aaron, and unpacking some of their ideas around critical and democratic pedagogy. I'm here today with a wonderful colleague of mine, Claire, and podcast crew member, Hayley, who will be bringing their ideas to this critical conversation. So welcome, Claire and Hayley. How are you both?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me today. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Turrbal and Yagara people whose lands we're on here in Minjan in Brisbane. My pronouns are she and her. I'm Claire, by the way.
Thank you, Claire. And what about you, Hayley? How are you travelling?
Good today. Wonderful to be here. I'm Hayley, obviously, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations people whose lands we record from today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we might start with you, Claire. So Can you tell us a little bit about you, or tell the listeners a little bit about you and what has brought you to this conversation?
Sure. So I'm a first in my family graduate social worker. Mm-hmm. I first entered the social work field as a worker probably around the age of 19 when I was still studying. And I very quickly found myself totally disillusioned by the political nature of the industry and quite overwhelmed, I think, at how far we have to go as a society. So that kind of led me to try a whole bunch of different industries to sort of explore where's my niche within that. So I did youth work and worked in the disability space and ended up in international community development. And even there, I kept kind of hitting neoliberal sort of walls and conservative spaces. So that kind of led me to seek inspiration from critical practitioners, educators and mentors like yourself, like Christine and Phillip, and, you know, so many other different theorists to sort of start to explore what could be possible. And ended up sort of moving me into the critical pedagogy space of trying to find spaces of consciousness raising and education in the direct practice work that I was doing in the field. And I loved that. I love sort of seeing what is possible in terms of education through the way that we work with people.
Absolutely.
And sort of ended up, I guess, that was my journey into becoming a critical educator or a critical pedagogue myself, where I sort of eventually about 6 years ago ended up at QUT where I teach now, as I realised that was a sort of space that I could really engage with practitioners as they're starting out their careers learning to be social workers and human service workers. Yeah. So that sort of brought me here.
Such diversity in your experience. And I know you're a bit of a traveller as well. You like to travel. And what the listeners wouldn't know also is that our relationship has been as I've been an educator for you as a student, and now we're colleagues as well. And yeah, it's been so wonderful to see to have this relationship and for us to both be critical pedagogues and both be first in our family to do university, and the same with Christine and Phillip. And what about you, Hayley? Tell us a little bit about you and what's brought you to this conversation.
As a starting point, I was also the first in my family to go to university. I'm a social work student and a member of the podcast team, so chipping away at that degree. Before coming to the social work course, I worked as a counsellor and a variety of other direct practice, working directly with people type roles in the field. So social work for me has been a chance to kind of apply that critical lens, apply some of those ideas around how we work with people to my practice.
Wonderful. So much knowledge and wisdom in this room today. I love it. So I'm wondering, is it okay to start with you, Hayley, and just ask what stood out to you in relation to Christine and Phillip's conversation that they had with Aaron?
To start with, I found the idea that Phillip introduced around the idea that no discipline is value-free, and that includes social work. It includes those that are empirically based on knowledge, so scientific disciplines that are about observation and experiment.
Yep.
And I guess the idea that we contend that we are value-free and that we're not advocating for a position. I think his lecturer spoke about it as a form of academic dishonesty.
Yes, and it was a Marxist teacher, wasn't it, that he was speaking to, and looking at the ways that Western conservatism is seen as kind of a natural, objective and neutral thing, but actually is a potential bias. And so recognising the ways that we can critique those understandings that any education is neutral, or any understanding. We talk a lot in social work about evidence-based practice and that being an objective way to bring practice. However, critical practice is seen as biased. However, when we look at it from that perspective, it's more that all practice has a bias. Some bias is more towards a westernised or conservative approach to practice, and some are more critical and founded on social justice practice. Did you want to add anything, Claire?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to distinguish, because of course we're all biased, but it's often only more left-wing or socially justice orientated perspectives that get considered as biased, and things that are the status quo are just assumed to be natural and normal and inevitable, like we just magically found this knowledge, rather than how that's actually created by, dominant social forces in our world and how it maintains that.
Yes, and in my own practice, I know that I intentionally orient my practice towards social justice, and so I don't ever pretend that my knowledge is neutral, that I bring. I don't pretend that it even could be. However, I am bringing it from a legitimate space, and it's always linked to critical theory, which is the critical theories that actually sort of sit behind the critical pedagogy that I bring, or the critical education that I bring. And I guess it's framed in that space of this is about social justice, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And then it's not baseless. It's incredibly informed by theory and context, but it's just a different lens that we can bring to a space, which is freeing, I think, because it allows us to have conversations that mainstream education might not give us. It allows us to think about what's possible and look for hope in the world, rather than, how do we just accept what our world currently looks like. It gives critical theories and social justice lenses give us, I think, educated hope for what's possible.
You mentioned something about common sense last time we had that conversation. Do you remember?
I think we were discussing the idea of common sense or common knowledge, and how that idea is, I guess for want of a better word, socially constructed. It's created through our relationships, our language, our actions towards one another.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Hayley, and I think that idea that we can be value-free or having common sense, like the way I think of common sense is that we're doing practice that is based on theoryless practice. And so we're not bringing theory to practice. And therefore that idea of that notion of common sense, which comes from the assumptions of being unbiased and things like that, is flawed when you're working with people who, for example, might be marginalised and we don't recognise that, or they come from a diverse background and we're not recognising that. So the idea that we can be neutral and treat everyone the same and treat everyone as equal can be challenged when we bring other sort of critical theories into that and bring critical pedagogy into that. But we haven't really spoken about what critical pedagogy is. So do we want to have a bit of a conversation about that?
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation to have.
Where do you want to go?
Well, I guess, starting out with the thought about what is critical pedagogy, because it's one of those big words that we throw around a lot, but can be really confusing to sort of think about what does that mean. And I know that, a common definition is sort of that the idea of it is it's a form of teaching or a form of education that questions that education can be neutral and that it's reduced to a set of methods and techniques. And that sort of goes to what we were talking about before about, of course, our teaching and our worldviews will always be biased. But it also challenges this idea, I think, that education is just about what to think, whereas critical pedagogy to me is about how to think. And that's a really important distinction, I think, in practice. Critical pedagogy is critical theories. They give us the opportunity to think about not just how to understand the world, but also then how to change it. And that's that Marx's quote, I think, that I really love, is we need that ability to not only understand it, but to also change it. And critical pedagogy gives us that space to start thinking really creatively about what could be possible.
Critical education is about consciousness raising in the ways that we can educate everyone about these ideas and things like that. One of the really interesting quotes, and then I'll come to you, Hayley, because I think you might have some stuff to say to this as well, that I love from Henry Giroux, and Christine spoke about Henry Giroux and how he's sort of really influential in the critical pedagogy space, is that critical pedagogues are critical agents who actively question and negotiate the relationships between theory and practice, critical analysis and common sense, and learning and social change. So all of the things that you were just saying, Claire, about it's not just about thinking critically, it's also about recognising how that is linked to social change and how that is also linked to the ways that we educate and share knowledge to be able to do that.
Yeah.
What about you, Hayley? What are some of your thoughts?
To that, I'd add the idea, and it sounds like a bit of a scary idea, around consciousness raising. And it's a little bit of a complex term that's just used to describe the process of the student or the student and the teacher for that matter, because critical pedagogy is a mutual learning process, but it's that process by which we become aware of our conditions and come to be able to question it. So when we're talking about critical education that encompasses critical pedagogy, we're looking at that process of being able to question some of those dominant ideas in society, as opposed to the technicist, the techniques, the approaches. The minimal encourages the counselling skills, the everyday nitty-gritty of practice. It's about that ability to question and to encourage those we work with to question their conditions as well.
Absolutely. And so it's not just a process for students as an education process, it's a process how we can use it in practice to actually support different education for the people that we work with as service users, for example.
And I think it's really important to note in that as the teacher, whether it's in a classroom context or as a social worker or human service worker, we're not the holder of knowledge imparting that wisdom into the person that we're working alongside. It's co-creative, as you said, Hayley. It's about us really rejecting traditional power imbalances of the teacher knowing everything and that banking model. I think in the podcast that they spoke about,
So those earlier Freirean ideas where critical pedagogy sort of comes from.
Yeah, and really moving towards actually how do we share the wisdom that we have as the educator in a way that can co-create new possibilities with the people that we're working alongside. And I think that that's a really important distinction, because it allows everyone in that space to contribute rather than it just being a one-way or one-directional sort of learning opportunity. But how do we consciousness raise collectively? How do we come together? And then how do we think about what's possible? Similarly, the social worker then isn't the one imposing interventions, but that actually comes in partnership with the people we work with.
And it also comes from us challenging our own assumptions.
Yes.
And having critically reflective or critical self-reflection on our own biases, our own assumptions that we bring that might be unhelpful to practice. And so some of the what we call discourses or structures of power that we have as taken for granted in our ideas that are assumed to be neutral, that can impact on the way that we might potentially work with someone in a really patronising way or a pathologizing way, so a more medicalised way and things like that. And so being able to have language to reject or resist those assumptions that we might bring to practice.
And maybe to challenge the idea of what common sense is.
Yes.
And the things we do unconsciously that oppress people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's also really exciting, because then we don't have to have all the answers going in. We get to sit there and explore it and play with the ideas with the people that we work alongside. And usually, critical pedagogical approach, people come up with all kinds of creative ways or ideas of seeing the world and effective change that I would never have considered, because I don't have that same experience that they do. And I think that that's what it opens up, is to hear stories and hear voices and hear perspectives and ideas from people that we might never have considered before.
Yeah, absolutely. Through that dialogue and that dialogical approach, I think Phillip was talking about it. It's really important to have dialogical conversations. Democratic decision making comes into that as well, or democratic kinds of leadership come into that, where we do recognise that everyone needs to have a voice in the decisions that are made in our society. And so that's a really good segue to maybe talk a little bit about democracy and what that means, or what that might mean to you.
I have to say I'm critical of modern forms of democracy.
Yep.
I feel like that's something that really needs to be examined. And I think my main criticism of democracy is actually that it's become fused with what I'd call a neoliberal logic. And it's a condition of, I suppose one of a better term, late capitalism. It's infused with the logic of capitalism, the managerialism, the efficiencies, the chipping away of public goods, like education, healthcare. And so I think the democracy we see is actually very different to what you would consider democratic, or what would ideally be considered democratic, the idea of representing society and maximising outcomes for the greater good.
Absolutely. So there's some unpacking to do there, because there was a lot of big words in that one.
Apologies, guys.
No.
But important points.
Absolutely important points. And so if we were to define what democracy is, and I've got a bit of a definition here. So democracy means the rule by the people. The word comes from the ancient Greek words demos, or the people, and kratos, the rule. A democratic country has a system of government in which the people have the power to participate in decision making. However, what you're saying, Hayley, is that system's probably not as equal as what it could be. And there's some extra information here. So each democracy is unique, and works in different ways. In some democracies, citizens help make decisions directly by voting on laws and policy and proposals and so on. In others, like Australia, citizens choose representatives to make decisions on their behalf. And so depending on the representation that you have to choose from would depend on how neoliberal, as you said, and we'll definitely unpack that word because it's a big part of critical pedagogy, but also how sort of left-wing or right-wing that might be. And I know you had some comments, Claire, about what's your idea of democracy and where do you fit in with that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and very contested subject, this idea of democracy. I was sort of thinking about it in terms of, you know, what it looks like in Australia. And given that, you know, what are we in? We're June 2022. We've just had the federal election.
Yes, we
To
have.
me, that was a really, really powerful representation of democracy at work as we see it and understand it in the context of Australia.
And a relief for many people in the social work and human services field.
Absolutely.
To have Anthony Albanese as our new Prime Minister, to have such a representation from the Greens, to have a lot more representation outside of the major, I think, and more women. Yeah, I think it was a fabulous outcome for us.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the power that democracy has, right? Is we've all been navigating some of the most catastrophic, terrifying experiences over the last few years with COVID-19, unaffordable housing, at this point, unsurvivable rising costs of living. Brisbane had just seen the floods in which we saw the Liberal government, and led by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, absolutely fail the Brisbane people by setting up a GoFundMe account to respond to the floods instead of using the flood relief funding that we have allocated in our budget. And I think it was a really powerful example of when our government becomes so divorced from the social realities of the people that they're meant to be representing. You know, I saw it as a real push for people starting to say, no, I need some more of a voice in what I say. That's where we saw the massive swings to, you know, to teal movements, to electorates that had been traditionally blue Liberal electorates turning green, turning red.
Yes. So for the students that are listening to this, they might not know what a teal is.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit what the teal is? So it's an independent representative.
Yeah. So I guess it's looking at non-mainstream forms of government. So in Australia, we've got a two-party system where the Liberal government and the Labor government have traditionally always been in power. And it's usually been a two-horse race where it's one or the other that gets power. But as we're moving towards, I would say, probably a more politically aware and desperate society, we're starting to see the rise in independent parties, in green movement parties, in a push to really be starting to think about climate change and how we're all going to survive that. And I guess starting to really think about the world and think about the country that we want to live in a way that I think is more socially just. And we were seeing that with the voting. But, you know, if we think about critical pedagogy, I see it really starting to come in the way that Australia started talking about politics. We had our mainstream media talking about sort of the general not normal, but mainstream conversations of the Liberal and the Labor Party. But then we actually started seeing all these new different platforms where younger generations in particular were starting to have critical consciousness raising conversations about what needs to change. And TikTok, for example, was a really good example of that, where people were sharing their opinions about, you know, affordable housing and about the aged care sector and about all these different social issues that were important to them. And they were actually connecting together. They were skipping the mainstream platforms. They weren't even talking to the mainstream politicians. They were coming together and finding ways of starting to educate each other about that. And I would have students coming in and saying, hey, I saw this TikTok about how the Liberal government's going to defund this social service sector. This is why I'm going to vote for a different party. Or, hey, did you see that one about housing? Or did you see that one about something else?
Absolutely. And I think the housing crisis was a big part of that too, because if you think of how many young people are not able to even have the vision of owning their own home.
Yeah.
It's like even actually having a place to live is a big deal at the moment. And so the higher levels of homelessness and things like that impact people who are most marginalised in our country. And so therefore that education is coming out through these critical conversations that are being happening in many different platforms, and that's where that creativity comes into it as well. So we're having critical and creative conversations through many different platforms. It's really good to see, isn't it?
And especially at a time where we've all been in lockdowns.
Yes.
You know, to be able to talk about social issues from the comfort of your couch in your pajamas. And communicate with people all over the place. That's something that we hadn't really seen before. And certainly not in previous elections in the way that we see it now. So I think it changes the way we as a society start to engage with each other.
Absolutely. So I'm aware that you originally brought up the word neoliberalism, and then Hayley brought up the word neoliberalism. Did you want to speak a little bit more about how that relates to democracy, or how that relates to critical pedagogy and social work and human services and the way that we do things?
I think following from what we've just been discussing, I think critical pedagogy, what we're seeing is, I suspect there's this, I suppose this point at which people can't ignore their own conditions anymore. When society gets to a certain point, people become aware really acutely of how they're being oppressed by the conditions and by people who don't represent them. And I suspect that's a lot of what we've seen with this election, particularly around issues like climate change, housing, we've just discussed.
And the ignorance that came from that. It's like, oh, we'll just not think about it, or we'll just pretend that we're doing something about it, and everything will be okay.
Yeah, most certainly that we'd rather keep this, how would you say it, this particular group happy than address climate change, even though a lot within that group are actually preparing for that anyway, because a lot of business groups are seeing that the survival of their own industries rely on this, and yet we have leaders that couldn't come into that policy space.
And Hayley, are you talking about groups who have privilege? Like, groups of people who do have the resources and do have the access and all of those things to be able to, I guess, not overcome, but to be able to work with that where other people wouldn't have those things. So keeping people happy who are already part of the privileged Western dominant system.
That's it. Our coal producers arguably are towards the top of that hierarchy, whereas most of us, how would you say it, who kind of the rest of the population, their way of speaking is to vote and to have these discussions on TikTok and other platforms that have arisen to be able to question why our leadership is not addressing these things.
Yeah. And so when Christine and Phillip talk about neoliberalism and bring that into the picture, and I know Christine mentioned like hegemonic understandings of society, and when we talk about hegemony, we're talking about sort of the structures and the power relations and the people who are in power making decisions for the whole community according to their position in society. And so they're expecting that everybody would have the capacity to do the things that they could do, and so the decisions are made according to the Western male privileged, rich, able-bodied dominance, and those decisions being made by people in those positions and reinforced through media, reinforced through other platforms to build a society that actually supports the privileged and not so much everybody else that's involved. And that ties into kind of neoliberalism, in that sort of neoliberalism provides the mechanisms to be able to do that, I suppose. And so when I talk about neoliberalism, I think of it as having two parts to it. And one part of it is about bolstering the economic market. And so that's about everything that we do being contributed to upholding capitalism. or the capitalist system, which is the system that we use in Australia and most of the world. And so it's global capitalism Christine spoke of. And so the ways that the economic market is prioritised in everything that we do pretty much all over the world. And then the other side of it is around individualising problems and self-responsibility. And so encouraging people to be responsible for their own situations and working that out individually and not relying on welfare and breaking down or deregulating the welfare system so that there's less money for people who are seen as not deserving and things like that. And Christine talks about that a little bit more too. But I want to pass to you, Claire. What are your ideas around neoliberalism?
Yeah, I think you've given a really good sort of summary about what neoliberalism looks like there. And I think the important point there that you were talking about with welfare is when we individualize it and say, well, that's your individual problem, we completely take it away from the social context. So instead of, all women experiencing oppression under patriarchy or people of colour experiencing oppression through racism, we start to blame people's individual situations on them and say, well, you made a bad choice, instead of we live in a world that sets up winners and losers.
And they internalise that too.
Absolutely.
And blame themselves.
Yeah, and we take that on and we believe that. And it's sort of, I think it's sort of like the air around us. We don't always see it. It's hidden, it's invisible. But it's like this really heavy weight that we experience around us. And so, of course, then that comes into our social services in social work and human services and in education as well. Just like the government decides what policies they want to look at and what's important based on mainstream media, neoliberalism works to also influence what gets funded in universities, what kind of social work and human service work get funded. We see prioritising of 6-week programs that focus on cognitive behavioural theories and budgeting classes for people experiencing harsh poverty.
Yeah, and cognitive behavioural theory, because that's a more individualised way of dealing with it. So people have to sort of change their behaviour so they fit into society. Yeah.
And conform in their thinking to fit into society.
Yeah.
Whereas, a more critical approach would say, no, our personal experiences are politically located. They're connected to what's happening around us. If we have unjust societies, we're going to experience injustice for ourselves. And I think neoliberalism, like you said, works really, really well with capitalism to maintain that divide of, we talk about the 1%, but it's the 99% of us who often end up doing it tough, and the lower percentage of that who are even more socially disadvantaged through poverty, through racism, through ableism, through ageism, through, cis privilege, through all different forms of structural oppression.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've summarised that really well. I want to bring it back to Giroux. So Henry Giroux speaks a lot to neoliberalism, and he talks about, I've got a quote here, he believes neoliberalism has framed individual worth as equal to one's economic output. And so your worth is based on how you contribute to the economic market. So people who are unemployed on a disability pension or an aged pension are seen as less worthy because they are not able to contribute to the economy. However, somebody who's aged has contributed to the economy for their whole life, and now they're all of a sudden not worth anything because they can no longer contribute to the market. One of Christine's quotes is that the main goal in supporting global capitalism is to shut down our ability to think and critique. So she said that and I thought that was really interesting. And there were ideas around neoliberal soldiers that come from that. And I think you might have another term that you use, Claire.
Yeah, I don't know if I termed it or whether or not it came from somewhere else, but I sort of talk about it as neoliberal zombies.
Yes.
And it's sort of when we get when we lose that ability to think, when we kind of go back to the conversation we had before about education, there's that difference that Phillip talked about between education and training.
Yes.
And if training is just teaching us what to think and how to do these skills-based activities, then we've got no critical capacity to think.
And we often call that technicist.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're doing a technique instead of thinking about the ways that we might approach a situation because of the broader structures, because of the people that are involved and the diversity of their experience, because of their marginalisation and disadvantage within this westernised society, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I kind of talk about it as neoliberal zombies, where we know what we're supposed to do, and then we just follow it. We don't actually know why we're doing this thing that we're supposed to be doing. And there's very little hope. There's very little idea of transformation or social change. It's just, I'm going to do this thing to fix this individual person, and that's going to be my job. And then I go home at the end of the day. And we just sort of become zombies, just following the status quo instead of thinking about, what's possible and what could happen and how could we change the world?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's where we end up burning out as well. For me, my experiences of working in the industry, when there's no hope, when there's no possibility for change, gosh, what's the point of it then? And critical approaches give us something different. They give us chances to be hopeful and not to be zombies, but to be active and conscious and engaged and come together instead of just being individual.
Yeah, Christine explained it as decentering ourselves as an educator or as a practitioner, and developing critical consciousness so you can position yourself as an agent for social change rather than for social conformity. And so that social conforming space that you're in, where you're fitting people into society according to what somebody else told you to do, rather than thinking critically about the ways that you're practicing and becoming an agent for change, so that that person is not having to fit themselves in to something that is broken. Yeah. Hayley, neoliberal soldiers, tell us your thoughts.
I love the imagery that Christine's brought in here. I did relate it to the social work discipline and the roles that social workers can take. I note that we quite often expect it sometimes of some of the other institutions we encounter. If you think about people's interactions with Centrelink or with other agencies that have that goal of managing people. But for the social work profession, I think the risk of becoming that foot soldier is where we're reduced to a form of social control. And I think there are soft ways of shaping that, of being that foot soldier. And I think there's the hard end of that too. So some of those soft forms of social control can be, for example, through the counselling process, where you might engage in ways of being with the clients that are about shaping their behaviour when their behaviour isn't the problematic aspect of their lives.
That's a really good point. Yeah. And so what critical pedagogy would say is that the hard and the soft is problematic, and we need to look at the ways that we don't do either of those things, and we actually provide the person with agency and self-determination to be part of the decisions in their life according to the broader understanding that they have that this isn't their fault, you know, and they're not in those circumstances because of anything that they have done, that it's a bigger and broader systemic issue.
Yeah, and in order to do that, we need to critically analyse our own position within that to understand how we can do that so easily.
Because it would be easy just to listen to other people and put them in the position of expert and say, oh, well, that's what my supervisor told me I have to do, and so that's what I have to do, without any recognition of the harm that could cause to the person at the other end. And and a lot of harm has already been done historically to people through social work and human services. And so this is about being able to decolonise social work, and especially with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities where colonisation has been a really big deal, and social work has been has participated in the ways that child removal happens, and it's still an overrepresentation of First Nations people in the child protection industry, and so in those areas. And so it's really important that we're thinking about and questioning the ways that we practice if that is going to be harmful for people in their particular situations, especially if marginalisation or disadvantage is part of that.
If anyone's interested in, I guess, some of the hard end of that foot soldiering or social control, there is a really interesting documentary, After the Apology, that I've recently been directed to, and it's a really good examination of child removal post the apology.
And we'll make sure that that's available for listeners. So that would be great. Thank you for that,
Joella.
Yeah. So from here, we've been given the wrap-up signal, but there's a couple of things I wanted to mention before we do. And one of those things is that example that Christine gave in relation to the ways that people are seen as either deserving or undeserving. And she talked about emergency relief and how those technicist ideas, or that neoliberal soldiering and neoliberal zombieing, can be part of the processes where people are coming and they're wanting support, like welfare support for food, or they want vouchers and things like that. And they're met with having to be asked lots of intrusive questions and to recognise whether they're deserving, or to recognise how much welfare they've received beforehand and whether they are eligible for those things. So there's lots of criteria, and that's when neoliberalism becomes what we call managerial. And so it's about recognising the eligibility criteria and working as a business model and treating people not with humanity, but with business principles and things like that around targets and budgets and efficiency and those sorts of things. And so Christine was talking about the decent society and looking at it in a different way. And so that's something that we need to really think about when we're in those roles. Did you want to touch on that in are there other examples that you can think of in practice where it's looking at the ways neoliberalism has impacted? What do you think?
I think that this is a really exciting part, because this is where we start to look at where there's possibilities for resistance. So I had a student recently telling me a story about, she was in a similar situation in a welfare office where she wasn't supposed to give people any choice over the food that she was providing. And so her way of resisting neoliberalism, she didn't feel like she had much power in the organisation, but her way of resisting was to just leave the door open. And people would just call out, hey, I need this and I need this and I need this. And it was this really, really subtle way of affecting change. And I think when we're teaching students about how to think critically in their practice, these are the things that come out. And
it's really easy to do that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pragmatically, it doesn't take a lot. It takes a lot of thought and thinking about how can we do this in a way that's not intrusive? How can we do it in a way that we're not overstepping too many boundaries in our work so that we get fired? Yeah. But how can we do it so that it's ethical and equitable?
Yeah. And that then opens up other doors to start conversations with your colleagues and consciousness raising with your colleagues, even if it's just about asking a really curious question of, can you explain to me why we do it this way? How do we challenge in these really subtle ways that actually do push back against neoliberalism? And just really quickly, I had another student recently who, actually it was a while ago now, a few different students who started taking their clients or their service users to protests. And so they would talk about the issues that were important to those people and then invite them to go alongside together to protest as a form of activism.
Absolutely.
And that, the people that they were working with talked about feeling so liberated because they're actually able to affect change about the oppression that they were facing. We had young people in youth organisations going to the school strike for climate change. We had like 30 different students and organisations coming for the March for Justice last year for women. And, I think those tiny examples of leaving a door open or asking a question are important, but also to acknowledge that can lead to these really, really great, really big collective forms of social change as well.
Yeah. and so important, and also important for our well-being as practitioners when we're seeing all this really hard stuff all the time.
Yeah, that's what fills me up when it's all hard to take to the streets and get in with other people who have like-minded views and find your allies in those communities.
Look, I think we could just chat for hours and hours and hours, and I'm going to kind of wrap it up now. Hayley, was there anything further that you wanted to say before we wrap up?
No, I think Claire spoke to that shaping and that impact really beautifully.
And I just wanted to finish off with Christine's words. And so some of the things that she mentioned about resistance and about what we can do, even though this is really overwhelming and there's a lot of heavy stuff in this, what we can do to create change. And she mentions becoming a citizen that contributes to a radically just and democratic world through social activism, which Claire just spoke to, for a more socially just society. Develop a community of learning and have critical conversations in your own circles. Engage in critical analysis and critical self-reflection to challenge neoliberal conditioning in ourselves, and to not give up on critical practice. Find allies, work together collectively, and always have that sort of idea of emancipatory social change. And so emancipatory social change is about freeing people from oppression, not doing what Hayley was talking about, and the hard and soft
forms of foot soldiering, for want of another word.
The hard and soft forms of
control.
Foot soldiering. So we're not alone in that. We get to be together, and when we talk about critical pedagogy, there is so many critical pedagogues out there, and we're part of that, and that's the reason there's so many, is because it is a collective. It's not an individual thing. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been an amazing conversation, and really appreciate that you were both able to come.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
Yes, thank you. It's been a lovely conversation.
And thank you, listeners, and we'll see you again soon.
If you'd like to keep up with any of our socials and to continue listening to future episodes, please follow us on Instagram. That's Critical Conversations, the number 4 SW.